What if we're not living in the year we think we are? Well, according to one theory, nearly 300 years of history from 614 to 911 CE were completely made up. Fake emperors, fake events, and a calendar hijacked by power-hungry rulers who wanted to rewrite time itself. Has an entire time period vanished from history? The phantom time hypothesis was introduced in 1991 by German historian and author Herbert Illig. The idea is simple but strange. About 300 years of history, specifically the years between 614 and 911 CE, were completely made up. If Illig is right, we're not living in 2025, we're actually in the 1700s, and everything from the early Middle Ages was just faked. See, Illig looked at the time period and noticed something he thought was kinda odd. There just didn't seem to be a lot there. Hardly any surviving records, barely any major cultural or technological shifts, and not much in the way of solid archaeological evidence. He didn't think that that was just a coincidence either. To him, it looked like those centuries were added later on, intentionally, and thought that the people we believe lived and ruled during that time were either exaggerated or completely fictional. According to Illig, this wasn't just a case of historians making mistakes. He believed it was a deliberate move, made by powerful people who wanted to rewrite the calendar for their own benefit. Whether or not that holds up is another story, but this theory completely flips the way that we think about the timeline of human history. Illig didn't think this fake time period just slipped in by accident. He believed there were real people behind it, starting with Holy Roman Emperor Otto III. According to the theory, Otto wanted to rule during the year 1000 CE because it had a big religious significance to it. Being the emperor during the first millennium, it just sounds impressive, and it tied neatly into Christian ideas about divine rule and prophecy and all that. The problem, well, he wasn't born in time, so the solution, according to Illig, was to change the calendar. Otto supposedly worked with Pope Sylvester II to pull this off. Together, they allegedly pushed the timeline forward by nearly 300 years to make it seem like they were living in the year 1000 when really it was sometime in the 700s. Illig also roped in Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII. He was known for being deeply interested in history and was responsible for copying and preserving many older texts. Illig thought that Constantine may have helped forge or edit certain documents to help fill in the gaps in this new adjusted timeline. Basically, these three leaders worked together, at least in the theory, to reshape the flow of time itself, making history fit the narrative that they wanted the world to believe. Another one of Illig's big arguments had to do with the calendars. Before the calendar that we use today, most of Europe followed the Julian calendar. It wasn't perfect, it was off by about 11 minutes per year, which added up over time. And by the 1500s, the seasons and dates were noticeably out of sync. So Pope Gregory XIII introduced the Gregorian calendar in 1582 to fix this. Now, the calendar change only skipped ahead 10 days to get things back on track, but if the Julian calendar had really been in use since Roman times without correction, Illig argued that the real difference should have been closer to 13 days. It's about 3 extra days unaccounted for, which in his mind matched the roughly 300 phantom years that he believed had been added. Most historians say these numbers aren't as straightforward as Illig made them out to be, but he saw this as a clue. If the math didn't add up, maybe the timeline didn't either. Illig also pointed to what's not there, specifically physical evidence. If the year 614 to 911 CE really happened, where's all the stuff from that time? He believed there was a noticeable lack of buildings, artifacts, and reliable written records from those centuries. For example, most of the castles, cathedrals, and major stone structures we associate with the Middle Ages didn't show up until after the year 900. And the ones that are claimed to be older sometimes don't quite fit stylistically with what came before or after. Illig thought that was suspicious, saying that those structures were either built later than we've been told or misdated entirely. Same goes for everyday items like pottery, tools, and coins. There's a noticeable dip in findings from that period, which Illig thought was too big to ignore. Now, most mainstream archaeologists say it's not that strange. Societies were shifting, literacy rates were low, and records just didn't always survive. But Illig saw it as a hole in the timeline, a gap that only made sense if those centuries never happened in the first place. Then there's Charlemagne, one of the most famous rulers of medieval Europe. Illig didn't just question his legacy, he straight up claimed that Charlemagne never existed. It sounds extreme, but here's how Illig looked at it. Charlemagne's story is full of larger-than-life accomplishments. He supposedly united a huge part of Europe, revived the Roman Empire in the West, pushed Christianity, and kickstarted what's known as the Carolingian Renaissance. That's a lot for one man, and the details are sometimes vague, inconsistent, or based on sources written long after his supposed death. And Illig argued Charlemagne was more of a political invention, a legendary figure created to give legitimacy to later rulers, especially the Holy Roman Emperors. It's a common move in history. Make up a heroic ancestor to strengthen your own claim to power. To Illig, the reign of Charlemagne was just too perfect, it was too clean, and too conveniently placed at the center of this supposed phantom time period. If those centuries were invented, then so was the man said to define them, in his view. Another part of Illig's argument involved strange patterns in the historical record, events that seemed to repeat across different cultures. He noticed that some of the major happenings in Byzantine, Islamic, and Western European history looked oddly similar, almost like they were copied or mirrored versions of each other. Not vague themes like wars or political struggles, Illig pointed out specific battles, rulers, and cultural developments that just seemed to line up a little too well, as if someone took one storyline and reworked it multiple times to make history feel more fleshed out than it really was. He believed these echoes were filler, recycled content used to patch together the fake centuries. Instead of inventing 300 years from scratch, the conspirators may have just borrowed pieces of real history from other time periods and repackaged them under different names and dates. That way, the fake era would still look real to anyone who was just skimming through the records. The early Middle Ages are often called the Dark Ages, and Illig took that term really literally. He believed that the lack of written records wasn't due to cultural decline, it was because those years simply didn't exist. He pointed to how few documents survived from 614 to 911 AD compared to other eras, and sure, some writing exists, but a lot of it was copied later or is based on oral traditions passed down and written long after the fact. There's very little that comes directly from that period. For Illig, that was a major red flag. In his view, this wasn't a time when people stopped writing, it was a time that was invented, and that the documents were either retroactively created to make it look real or just never needed because nobody lived through it in the first place. Most historians disagree, saying that war, disease, illiteracy, and collapsing governments made it just harder to preserve knowledge back then. Now for some pushback. One idea is that the weird gaps and inconsistencies come from simple human error. Back in the day, most records were copied by hand. Scribes made mistakes, misread dates, or changed things to suit local politics or religion. Over time, those little errors could have snowballed into bigger timeline problems. Others say that natural disasters might have caused the slowdown, huge volcanic eruptions, plagues, that could have thrown entire societies off track for long periods of time. It would explain why so many things seemed to kind of pause during the early Middle Ages. Things just sucked, and people were busy trying to survive, not building cathedrals or writing books. There's also the possibility that the records did exist but were lost, burned in wars, which there were a lot of, or just rotted away with time. In that case, the holes in history are real, but they don't mean the years themselves were fake. So while Illig's theory pretty wild, it does at least point out some genuine gaps in our understanding, gaps that could have explanations a bit less dramatic than time fraud though. The academic world didn't exactly embrace Illig's theory. Historians, archaeologists, and scientists from all over have looked at his claims and they've pushed back hard. One of the biggest rebuttals comes from astronomy too. We have records of solar eclipses and comets and other sky events going back thousands of years. Those records match up with modern calculations. If a solar eclipse was reported in the year 755 and we can confirm that one did happen, it's a strong sign that the timeline is correct. Things like Halley's Comet have been tracked across centuries, and those sightings line up with the current calendar, not one that's 300 years off. Then there's dendrochronology, or tree ring dating. Scientists use tree growth patterns to track years with really incredible accuracy. Those rings also confirm the existing timeline with no missing centuries. Most experts agree Illig was misreading the data. Still, they don't dismiss what he brings up altogether. It's flawed, but it is interesting. So, if historians have shut it down, why do people still believe in the phantom time hypothesis? Part of it comes down, well, a lot of it comes down to mistrust. A lot of people don't fully trust governments, religious institutions, or experts like historians in general. The idea that those groups could have worked together to rewrite history plays right into that suspicion. It's not just about the dates, it's about control, about who gets to decide what's true and what isn't. There's also a kind of thrill in imagining that we've been living in a lie, that everything we know about the past is off by centuries. It taps into that same appeal as hidden civilizations and long-lost ancient knowledge. People love a good cover-up story, and let's face it, history is full of holes. We don't have all the answers. So when someone like Illig shows up with this bold, strange idea, it does grab people's attention, whether that's right or not. All that said though, I've been your host James, and I'll catch you, yes you specifically, in the next video.